talk to you today about the survey that the Embry Family Foundation commissioned us to do over the last couple of weeks. As Lauren had introduced, my name is Josh Uliber. I'm a partner with Lake Research Partners, and you can look at our website for more information on our firm and the kind of work we do. But what I want to talk to you a lot about today is that survey and the findings from that survey. And I've got 20 minutes. Maybe it'll take 15 maybe, so I can't, we can't go into a great bit of detail, but I want to give you the top lines and sort of the top of mind things that were particularly important in that survey. But before I do that, let me describe what the survey was, the methods of this survey. It was a survey of Dallas residents, city residents in Dallas. It included all adults, so it's not just voters, it's not just likely voters, it is all adults. And so that's important for us because this survey is going to be a lot more diverse than you would see in a survey of likely voters and a lot more diverse than you would see in a survey of registered voters. So it includes the spectrum of all adults in this great city. What I want to commend, honestly, the Embry Family Foundation for really the effort they put into funding this survey, because we made efforts to translate it into Spanish so that it was available if the respondent wanted to hear it in Spanish. They could take the survey in Spanish. We made an effort to call cell phones, not just landlines, because people of color, African Americans, Latinos, are more likely than Anglos to be cell phone households. And when you call more cell phones, when you translate it into Spanish, those things cost money. And it was a real effort in terms of making sure that we made those efforts to really include a broad spectrum of Dallas residents. And they also made an effort to fill this oversample of Asian adults, because Asian adults are in the survey, but they wouldn't have been enough of Asian adults in the survey to have taken a look at them individually if we didn't conduct that oversample or attempt to conduct that oversample. So really what you're looking at today is really a representative sample of adults in Dallas, not likely voters, not registered voters, but a real representative sample of all adults in Dallas. As you can see here, it was taken at the end of October, just before Halloween. It was in the field for about a week, and then the margin of error of on a sample of 600 is about 3.5, 4 points. So if that's what the survey looked like, or who we talked to, let me talk a little bit about what we found. And there's really 6 big findings that came out of our first look at the survey. And the first one really is about optimism. Dallas residents think race and race relations and racial equality is going to get better over the next 5 years as opposed to getting worse. But what I want us to look at when we get to the data, and I'll show you actual numbers in just a moment really, is there's a big group of folks who say stay the same. And when you think about Americans, and when you think about our society, we're not a group of people who like to stay the same. We like things to constantly get better. Education, our economy, our wages, healthcare. We like things to get better. So when you see this group of people who say stay the same, it's not necessarily a good thing. It's something for us to think about and understand how would we address that so that we move those people who say stay the same into the getting better category. I'll show you that with some data in a moment. But the good news is there's optimism around race relations, and equality in Dallas, and we should think about ways to sort of capture that optimism and really point to the future. There are 2 big areas when you think about motivating confronting racism and racial discrimination in Dallas, and we'll talk about both of those. The 2 big things, the 2 big values are children and the economy. And the second point on this screen points to that first one, children. 90% of adults in Dallas said we need to end racism and racial discrimination for the sake of our children. Our children deserve better. As a pollster, we almost never see data where 90% of the public agrees on anything, especially in today's day and age when things are so divisive and political. You almost never see the 90% number in any of our survey work. So it's really astounding. It's not just a value now, but it really has transcended values in terms of stopping racism for our children. People believe our children deserve a better future, a future without racism. And we'll talk more about that in a moment, but it's really a strong rallying cry for people. It's what brings people together in terms of this discussion about racism and racial discrimination. The second big issue that sort of unites communities when it comes to thinking about racism and racial discrimination and diversity is the economy. That if we can take advantage of our diversity, if we can take advantage of all of our talents, the economy will get better, and all of us will rise with it. And that's also a very big uniting factor. The difference between children and economy, though, is interesting and good for us to talk about. Children really is a value, right? For our children, we ought to do this. They deserve something better. The economy really is sort of telling people if we can stop this, if we can do better, our economy can get better. So it's adding something to the value of ending racism, whereas children by themselves and doing better for our children is a value itself. The fourth big finding really has to do with leadership. And who do the residents of Dallas expect to lead the way? Who do they expect to do better? And there's really three groups of people in terms of that who answer. The first group of people is our public servants, school teachers, police officers, and that makes a lot of sense when we take a look at more of this data. Teachers, because remember back to the real value of children, right? It makes a lot of sense that teachers are a group that they really feel important about, and then our police officers. Because when we ask them what are the areas where you think racism and racial discrimination is most alive, they say our justice system and they say our schools. And so it makes a lot of sense that it's police officers and children, and our educators that they say are most responsible for teaching our children things differently and for enforcing our laws equally for everybody. The second group is our elected leaders, city council members, the mayor. This was a survey about Dallas, not about the nation, not about the state. And so we deliberately asked the mayor and city council. And those are the folks who they said, in terms of elected leaders, they are going to hold responsible and expect to lead on this issue. And we'll talk about some of that, and I'll show you the data in a moment. And then the third category really is themselves. They don't let themselves off the hook. They hold themselves responsible as well and believe they're equally as responsible for confronting, for ending, and for doing better on racism and racial discrimination. So if that's the good news, optimism, children as a value, hooking things to the economy, holding elected leaders and our public servants accountable, there are some things for us to think about, and it comes clear in this data in terms of things for us to work on. The first is, and it's not really on this slide yet, I'll talk about it more and show you in a moment, is really the intensity around confronting racial discrimination and racism. Folks in Dallas have a lot on their minds. Sending their children to good schools, finding better jobs, making their community safe, that when they think about racism and racial discrimination, it doesn't become the top issue for them. It permeates everywhere in many cases, but it's a responsibility potentially for this campaign to raise that intensity around facing racism and racial discrimination. And so when we took a look at this data overall, we saw great interest in confronting racism, but not great intensity, and that's really the job of a future campaign. The second sort of challenge for us is to really foster this sense of a shared fate. And what I mean by that is when we asked in the survey who faces the most racism, who faces the most racial discrimination, African Americans said African Americans, Latinos said Latinos, Anglos split all, in different areas. And it's actually, let me step back. It wasn't who faces the most racism. It was who faces racism and racial discrimination, period. So it wasn't comparing African Americans to Latinos or Anglos to anybody. It wasn't making those comparisons. It was, does this group face racism and racial discrimination or not? And you would see drop-offs between Latinos in their viewpoint about African Americans facing racial discrimination, and the same for African Americans and Latinos. And so when we think about what we ought to be doing as a city to move forward, this shared sense of fate, right, that racism deteriorates for everybody in every community. And if that's a shared fate we can develop, I believe that's a real way for us to think about increasing the intensity around this sense of how to face race and face racial discrimination. So if that's sort of the big findings, let me give you some numbers now so you can understand where and how we drew some of our conclusions. So this first slide is asking, do you think racism or racial discrimination is going to get better, stay the same, or worse over the next 5 years? And we split the sample. So we took our 600 residents and 300 heard racism and 300 heard racial discrimination, just to see if there was a difference in the language itself. And what you can see here is there wasn't much difference, honestly, between saying racism and racial discrimination. But what happens is the blue are folks who say better. And you can see a plurality in both cases say they think things are going to get better in the next 5 years. The red is groups who say worse. And you can see that's under a fifth. That's good news. You can see in the yellow is people who say the same. Remember, I hinted to this in the beginning that there's a lot of people out there who say things are going to stay the same. Not get better, not get worse, but stay the same. And again, as a country, when we think about moving and improving, we're not a group that wants to stay the same. And so I want us to take a look at this slide and really understand that there's a lot of folks who think things are going to get better out there. but there's a lot of folks who think things are going to stay the same. And that's nothing for us to rest on. That's really a challenge for us to move those people from the same to better. This is taking a look at the question by ethnicity and by race. African Americans, Latinos in the middle, and Anglos to your right. And at this point, we combined the language racial and racial discrimination. As you remember, there wasn't much difference, so we combined the two samples to get a larger, more robust sample. And as you can see here, there are some differences by race and ethnicity. Anglos all the way over to the right are the most positive, are the most sure things are going to get better. African Americans and Latinos in the middle and to your right are a little more split on the issue. They're not quite as sure. And in fact, a quarter of them think things could potentially get worse. And again, you do start to see some differences by race and ethnicity on this question. Still, better and the same equal, and fewer people say the worse, but there is some hesitancy among African Americans and Latinos on that question, whether things could potentially get worse in their city. We asked a series of agree-disagree statements. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? And I know it's hard for you to read. I'll read the ones that I think are really key for us. But as you can see, the first one is, for our children's sake, we need to do as much as we can to end racism. And you can see that's where we get to 91% agree and 83% strongly agree. And again, in polling, as a pollster, when I'm talking to other clients, I will say I want to see that intense number, that strongly agree number, get into the 40s. Because then I know I got a lot of people who really agree on something. And I want to see the overall agree number get into the 60s. And here we double the intensity that I look for into the 80s in terms of strongly agree. And we have virtually everybody agree overall that for our children's sake, we need to confront and end racism. Again, it's not just a value anymore. It's something that's really a core belief here. And what I think is interesting is, remember, this is a group of folks who are optimistic about race, and this really goes to the core of what that is because of children and ending it for our children's sake. They may, internalize, I've got my issues, they have their issues, but our children should not have to carry our baggage. And that comes through crystal clear in this research. And it's true across racial ethnicity groups, it's clear across age, it's clear across the regions of Dallas, it's clear across partisanship in terms of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. This is a widely held belief. There's really no disagreement. And so when we think about anchoring a campaign and potential message points, this is really something for us to think about because it comes across so strong and so intense. The next issues are also pretty strong. Remember, I said 40 is good, and all of these get into the 40s or above. The next one down is, until all of our citizens of Dallas, black, white, and brown, can participate equally in our city, our democracy will fall short. I'm going to show you another slide later on where the democracy language also works. So it worked particularly well among Hispanics, the democracy language. And it works here as well. Pretty good language here in terms of really holding on, growing this democracy, making sure everybody is able to participate. The next is, there are degrees of racism, and even the slightest or smallest biases can harm and divide our Dallas community. Here you can see that folks will say, yeah, there may be some racism, but even the tiniest bit is bad for us, and there's really strong agreement for that. Not a lot of people are willing to say even this tiniest bit of racism is okay. And the final one that really makes it onto the leaderboard here is, the racial and ethnic diversity we have in Dallas is a strength and makes Dallas stronger. And remember that diversity language, because I'm going to give you another message in a moment about the economy that really highlights diversity again. And that's something else that really unifies people, that if we can harness this diversity, it's going to make our economy stronger. And that brings lots of people over to the communication efforts. What you can see here, this is the question of who has responsibility for dealing with race in the city of Dallas. And we've boxed the big four, or the big five. Remember, I told you that there's three real groups, right? The first is our public servants, our teachers, and our police officers. And you can see police officers lead the way at 61%, having a lot of responsibility. Our teachers are third in that list at 54%, having a lot of responsibility. The second group that they sort of push together are our elected officials. And you can see the mayor is next at 56%, and the city council is fourth in that list at 47%. We didn't list the mayor's name, and we didn't list the city council. It was a generic mayor city council, but you can see here how they apply and how they really think as elected leaders are next in line. So it's our public servants, our teachers who are teaching our children, It is our police officers who are working to enforce our laws equally for everybody. It is our elected officials who are running the government and ought to make it right for everybody. And then if you can take a look, just right underneath the red line is people like you. 46% say, I have a lot of responsibility for dealing with racism in Dallas. When we ask a lot of responsibility or some responsibility, when we take the a lots and the sums together, that gets into the 70s of people saying, I have some responsibility. Still, a third of people out there saying, I don't have the responsibility, but the real reflection here is 70% of people say I have responsibility. So they're not willing to take themselves off the hook, and that's really the job of a future campaign is to put pressure on them to not let themselves off the hook. If you drop all the way down to the bottom, you'll see the arts community, you'll see public foundations, you'll see online groups and social media. Those are lower, 31, 27, 10%. It's not that people are saying those groups don't have a responsibility. What they're really saying is, I don't know. I'm not sure if they have a responsibility. I'm not sure how they'd have a responsibility. In the way that I see the race discussion and in the way I understand racial discrimination, I'm not sure where the arts or the online community would have a role. It's not that they're saying they don't have a role. They're not sure where. And so again, when we think about those communities, that's a burden for them, is to figure out where they would fit into the slot. It's not that they're saying they don't. They're trying to figure out how. I'm not sure I understand, is what we're learning from that data. This question asks, what area in life in Dallas is most affected by racial discrimination? And this was not a multiple choice question. So it's not like they could have, in their mind they could have said all of these things. And some of them did say all of these things. In their mind they could have said 2 of these things. But in the survey, I forced them to choose 1 of them to really add some intensity to their response. And as you can see, there are 3 groups that really lead the way here. The first is justice and the court systems. And remember, we had just showed a slide earlier that said police officers were the #1 group that they held responsible for really dealing with racism and equality in the city of Dallas. And it makes a lot of sense that they think that is the first area that there's a lot of racial discrimination. The second area is the box. Take a look at the second red box. You can see jobs and promotions and income and wages in workplaces. The money I earn, the money I take home, the promotions I can and can't get, lots in their mind of racism and racial discrimination taking place there. And remember, one of our key arguments, one of our key message traits here is the economy, right? And so you're seeing how this points back to the same things in many ways. And then the next bucket was education in our schools. And again, that makes a ton of sense with the focus on teachers being responsible and on children, ending discrimination and racism for our children's sake. We tested some messages, and this was the top message overall. It was particularly strong. It was strong with all of our racial and ethnic groups in Dallas. It was particularly strong with our Anglos. And this language says, Dallas has the potential to be one of the most dynamic and innovative economic centers in the United States. We have people of all different colors, from all over the world, with all kinds of skills, backgrounds, and languages. That diversity is one of our biggest assets, and we need to unite and use all our talent and ideas to grow and prosper. Lots of things happening in this language. The first is obviously the link to diversity and the economy, which we've been speaking about. The other I want to talk to you about, and I'll show you 2 other messages that tested well in just a moment, is remember these folks are optimistic about race and racial discrimination in the future. This doesn't start out by saying Dallas has a problem, we need to fix it, here's how. This really invokes things they feel good about and tells them we can do better. And I think that's a big hint for us in this research is in terms of how we get them to confront this problem has a lot to do with how we enter the conversation with them. You can see it worked with all of our communities, and it especially worked with our Anglos in terms of the economic message. Here are the 2 messages that work particularly well with African Americans and with Latinos. African Americans really like the American dream language, and I'll read it for you. It says, for Dallas to be the best city it can be, we need to make sure everyone in Dallas has the opportunity to achieve the American dream. By promoting racial equality, we make sure that the best and brightest are moving Dallas forward, regardless of their race. A more diverse Dallas will be a stronger Dallas. To your left is democracy. or actually to your right, I'm sorry, a working democracy needs everyone to participate, and Dallas is no different. That is why we need to work together to bring everyone into the process, have everyone's word be heard, and create a responsive government that we can all believe in. To do that, we need to work to increase participation in all communities, especially communities of color. African Americans especially like the American Dream language. Latinos especially like the democracy language. It worked. These messages worked for everybody, but those groups really really popped for them. So I'm going to go back for a moment. Economic was the strongest language for Anglos. American Dream was the strongest language for African Americans, and democracy was the strongest language for Hispanics in this survey. This is the slide about shared fate. Remember, I said that this is, if we think about things for us to work on, one of them is increasing the intensity around the discussion. People have a lot on their minds. It's our burden to sort of make sure that we get racism and racial discrimination into that conversation. The other one is the sense of shared fate, that this question is asked, which groups receive a lot of discrimination? We asked a lot, some, et cetera, but this captures the a lot. And you can see overall, African American men at the top of that list. African Americans next, gays and lesbians, Latinos and Hispanics, women, and then Anglo men at the bottom. If you take a look to your right, you'll see the data among different racial and ethnic groups. And at the top is African Americans, where African American men, 67% say African American men face a lot of racial discrimination, and 55% say African Americans in general. Gays and lesbians is next at 36%. Latinos and Hispanics is underneath 36% among African Americans. When you look at Latinos, they put themselves first at 36%, then gays and lesbians, and then African American men. African American men don't trail too far down from Latinos in terms of the data among Latinos, but you do begin to see that the sense of shared fate may not be as strong as we'd like it to be in this discussion, and that's, again, potentially one of our jobs and one of our burdens in this discussion is to think about the language around shared burden, shared fate. Anglos are a little more diverse. African American men at the top, African Americans next, gays and lesbians, and the Latinos face further down on that list as well. And so I think that is one of our big keys here, is a sense of shared fate and a really finding ways to increase the intensity around this discussion. I'm going to wrap it there. This is the demographics of the survey. And remember, it was a survey of all adults, so it was representative of those adults. So you'll see that it is more diverse in terms of race and ethnicity. It's a little younger than it would be for a voting profile. It's a little more democratic than it would be for a regular likely voter poll, because it's talking about the entire community. You can see the regions, and you can see whether they have children in the household as well. So I'm going to stop there, turn it back to Lauren. I think we have time for some questions after that, but thank you very much.